Hi guys, this is the second talk in the series on Druid meditation, and we've been looking about the Druids in the British Isles in particular, but also the tradition of what Druids are and how they are part of the spiritual landscape of Western Europe, and in particular the British Isles. So basically, after having gone around the world and looked at different types of meditation, for my own benefit partially, but also because I really want to dive into and find out sort of why we meditate, where that meditation comes from, the different styles of meditation, and the commonalities between the different practices and the different techniques throughout the world and throughout history. Now, I started my journey really in meditation looking at the yogic practices of India, and we know that they go back thousands of years, at least 5,000 years, maybe even longer. But when we look back at different cultures in history, we see that they've all had a spiritual practice. And meditation, to me, and I think to all meditators, is to do with finding out about who we are as human beings, tapping into a deeper sense of our spirituality, who we are, finding out about the universe and how the universe works and our relationship to that. Now, in our exploration of Taoism, we saw that it connects very much with nature, and I have been fascinated with the similarity between Taoism and the way the Taoists see meditation as well, with things like Zhuo Wang, sitting and forgetting, but also their connection with nature and things like Wu Wei, and the Tao itself and the flow and how that connects to nature. So in looking at my own sort of cultural route, which has been something that I've wanted to get into, I've wanted to explore more the cultural history of the British Isles and this part of the world. And this is the land of my ancestors, as far back as I've been able to trace my history, which has only been sort of just over 200 years. I know that my family were all more or less in the same part of England, sort of bordering towards the west, so not far from the Welsh sort of borders there. And my surname is Floyd, which has been, it's been noted that it's probably a derivation of the Welsh Lloyd, which literally means grey. So could be hence the hair and beard. I don't know. So possibly my ancestors were possibly grey at possibly a young age, which I say I was. Not such a young age now, anyway. But anyway, I digress strongly there. But to get back to the Druids, and why do I want to look into them as a people, as a priesthood, as important, significant characters in the spirituality of this land? Well, if we go back a couple of thousand years ago, the British Isles were kind of in a position whereby a lot of the Celts, which were the people of Western Europe, bordering onto the Roman Empire, a lot of them, after the Celts had kind of been a force to be reckoned with, shall we say, in Europe, and in fact had actually kind of been there in Rome and that part of Italy and that kind of part of the world before the Roman Empire came. Now we see that the Roman Empire is very strong. Obviously, we know that they're in the Middle East and places like Egypt, Judea, modern day Israel, and they have a strong sort of occupying presence in a lot of those parts of the world. We have the Emperor Julius Caesar, and he, after kind of having various battles with the what the Romans describe as sort of pagans, heathens, barbarians in Europe, um, which largely are the sort of the Celtic peoples, really, are the ancestors of the people here in the British Isles. So people from the area of sort of Gaul and Breton in France as well. Um, a big stronghold of the Celts at this point, after the Romans had got much stronger and were kind of pushing west, as it were, as kind of empires tend to do. They kind of it's never enough. If you're running an empire and you're an emperor, then whatever the size of your empire is never enough. And of course, we see this today, don't we, with certain strong nations in the world that doesn't really matter how big or how strong they are, they always seem to want more. And if you get some kind of megalomaniac at the helm of that particular empire, whether it's Julius Caesar or any of the other Caesars at Roman empires, emperors, or whether it's, you know, more recent sort of figures in history like Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, you name it, right up to the present day. And we have leaders in Europe and other parts of the world, the Americas, etc., who are still trying to stake a claim on other lands which are essentially the property, if you like. I don't like to say property, because to me the earth is not our property, not anybody's property. No lands are our properties. We are just custodians of the place where we live, and we are part of nature ourselves. And I think, to get back to the Celts, they understood that we are essentially a part of nature. We are a part of that. But to the Romans, a new bit of land, a new bit of... they were after minerals. And in the day, the rare earth minerals that were around were things like tin, which was very rich in the British Isles, and iron, etc. They were more than happy to try to invade this island, these islands on which I live now, and my cultural heritage comes from, and to kind of move in to try and stick the Roman flag there and say, this is now part of the Roman Empire, and thank you very much, we'll have your gold, we'll have your tin, we'll have your copper, your iron, etc., and we will make use of those. So not very much different from the kind of world scene that we have today, only obviously it's not the Romans that are doing it now. But you get the idea. So the Celts were a people who did not have one sort of rulership, they did not have one leader over them. They were a group of tribes, and they were across Western Europe, but as I say, the Roman Empire had kind of pushed them to the outskirts, as empires tend to do. The people who are still trying to put up a resistance and try to retain and hold on to their cultural heritage and beliefs and traditions, they kind of move outwards, sometimes intentionally pushed by the empire that's kind of trying to invade them. Sometimes it's they're literally just trying to get out of the way. So we have this stronghold of the Celtic way of life, and they didn't refer to themselves as Celts, they referred to themselves by their tribal names, and there were a lot of different tribes, just similarly to the way we see North America before the settlement of the European settlers. It was made up of tribes, sometimes occasionally had skirmishes between them, exactly the same as the Celts. and then you had kind of spiritual people, intermediaries, who would try to make peace between these different tribes. These, in the case of the Celts, were the Druids. So the Druids were firstly priests. They were also educators. So they educated in spiritual matters, but also because spirituality was very much a part of life. Think of some of these indigenous people in parts of the world. Their spiritual beliefs are not separate. They don't have a kind of a secular world and a kind of a spiritual world, because the two are combined, and they see that life is generally a spiritual journey, which I recognise. I'm on a spiritual journey, and the spiritual journey is my entire life. It's not a separate thing. I don't have my secular life over here and my spiritual life over here. The whole of life is a spiritual journey, a spiritual adventure. And so when we're talking about educators, they're educating people, of course, in things like, all of the things that we need in daily life, from cooking and farming and agriculture and systems of government and all these things. Education was all to do with that. The Celtic priests, the Druids, were very much arbiters. So as I said, between these tribes, when they'd had disagreements over different things, and as we understand, tribes generally, they come from a family. So that family gets bigger and it becomes an extended family, and then that extended family forms a sort of a tribe. So they have their own identity, and of course they want what's best for them. So that inevitably you have disputes with neighbours. It's no different really from today in that sense. But you had the Druids, who were the spiritual leaders, if you like. Now, when I talk about spiritual leaders, there's a very much, and this for me is something that fascinates me, because you have very much a magical sort of element in there as well. So sometimes when we think about spiritual, because in the Western world we kind of thinking along the lines of sort of Christianity, Judaism, things like this, the kind of religions that largely have outlawed kind of mystical, magical practices, then we don't generally think along the lines of our spiritual leaders historically in our written history as being involved in sort of magical practices. But of course, when you delve into the world of things like meditation, and you start to realise that meditation, for instance, is a gateway to altered states of consciousness, altered states of awareness. This is pure magic at work, and we're starting to really see some sort of magic in our lives if it's been lacking before. The number of people that get into meditation, and that maybe it's because they think of it as a kind of a holistic or a kind of a health-based practice, which is going to help them to relax, become more peaceful, which of course it does. It stops that mental chatter. And of course you understand from Buddhism, the concept of the monkey mind and that chatter and the noise that's going on in there. But also, and very much if we go back to the older yogic practices of India, there is the element of the magical there. There is the element, if we go back into the ancient Vedic scriptures and things like that, that we see elements of kind of the magical and things like this. And of course the yogis, even today there are yogis who people would ascribe to them kind of magical powers, etc., things like this. But the magical element was very much there in the Celtic way of life, and it all revolves around nature. Nature is seen as the source, if you like, of all of the spiritual energy. It's the world is a spiritual place, and we're just a small part of that spiritual place that is the world that we see around us. And if you look at the Celtic belief system, it is very much based in what we would describe as animism. Animism being an understanding that everything has a sort of a spirit in it. I'm not talking about sort of ghosts and, you know, woo-woo, that sort of thing, spirits, as in sort of disembodied beings, but I'm talking about everything in itself has its own spirit, has in essence a spiritual nature to itself. So whether it's an animal, animals would be seen as having spirits. Trees, very much so. Trees, incredibly important to the Celts and the Druids. In fact, I'll go into a little bit in a moment about the meaning of the word Druid itself. But it doesn't stop there. It goes on to things like water courses, rivers, lakes, the sea, having a spirit, even the mountains, the rocks, etc. Animism, this sense of animism that runs through the Celtic traditions, sort of understands that everything has got sort of a living spirit to it, if you like. There's a spirit flowing through everything. And in a lot of ways, that spirit is something which can inspire us all and drive us all to sort of flow with nature, which is very, very similar to the description of the Tao in the Tao Te Ching from China, and this understanding of what something like Wu Wei is, which is kind of that flow, like the flow of water. So we have this term, which is still used in the Welsh language now, the word arwen. Arwen literally means the flowing spirit. So the flow of this spirit through us, through the animals, through the trees, through the plants, through nature generally around us. We see this as, it's seen as this Arwen spirit which flows. So we can liken it in some ways to prana from the yoga traditions, or chi from the Chinese traditions. So it's kind of that flow of energy. We understand a bit more today through things like quantum mechanics and things like that everything is a waveform, everything is basically a flow of energy. So we can't boil down and bring down any solid object to the point, if we take it far enough down and we go down to that microscopic level, everything is a flow of waves, a flow of energy. So we understand a little bit more, even from a scientific point of view, that everything is a flow of energy. So this is an understanding that the Celts had, which is very deep, and links in, of course, as I say, to many other cultures around the world. This is what really sort of started to blow me away after having studied the Eastern traditions, to find out that our ancient Western European traditions actually had a common strand of that. There's very much like the shamanistic sort of aspects of things as well, that we recognise this connection between the other worlds as well. And in the Celtic tradition, there is, alongside this material world in which we live, there's also what's known as the other world, which is separated, it's seen, by a thin veil, and that veil becomes thinner at certain times of the year. In other words, they have things like solstices, which are celebrated by modern Druids these days, the summer and the winter solstice. These are times when the veil between this material world and the other world are seen as being quite thin and quite easy to pass over. And the Druids were very much seen as facilitators for those wishing to connect outside of this physical world. So again, what was in this other world? Well, they believed that not only our ancestors, those who'd gone before us and had passed away, could pass into this other world, but it was also the inhabitation of people like the fair folk, who we may call fairies, or little people. They're known by so many different terms: elves, goblins, spirits, nymphs, etc. Different cultures have called them different names, but every culture seems to have this tradition of smaller people. I'm not talking about little Tinkerbell characters, little insect wings. I'm talking about kind of a smaller race of people. I'll go into that in more depth in subsequent videos, but at the moment I just want to make mention of some of these things because there's an awful lot to unpack with the Celts and the Druids. And to understand the Druids, we need to understand a little bit of the Celtic world in which they were part and in which they were the priests of this time. The term Druid literally means, it comes from two words. So Dora or Doa, which is very similar from where our word door comes from this, literally means oak or a steadfast, a strong tree. It's pretty much understood that it refers to the oak tree being what became known as the king of trees, if you like, for its strength and its various properties, which were magical properties, of course, but also physically strong properties. And so we've got Dora and Wade. Wade meaning to see or to know. So Dora Wade becomes Druid when in association as the language adapts, and the Brythonic languages are quite fascinating, but they develop into these different strands of languages like Gaelic and Welsh and Pictish and things like this. So the languages of the Welsh, the Scots and the Irish have come from these sort of Brythonic languages, so which again have come from the Celts. So literally what we would understand the word Druid to mean is one who is a knower, who knows, who understands the oak, the wood. So it's somebody that kind of has an understanding. So the tree itself is seen as a very spiritual symbol. And we have this motif of what's known as the world tree, which comes through a lot of these ancient Western European cultures, from the Celts right up to the Norse, etc. We have this motif of the great world tree, where with its roots go down deep into the earth and the underworld, or the other world as it's known. The middle part is like our normal everyday life, through which we our senses make us a part of it, and in our five senses, etc. And then we have the upper branches, which are sort of representative of the heavens, the sky, and the potential that is out there, basically, and where we can go. Everything that this is made up of three parts, and everything very much. We have the ancient Celtic symbol of the triskelion, or the triskele, which literally means three-legged, 3 legs. It's made up of 3 spirals. Spirals being very much synonymous with nature, because the spiral is something that we see in nature very much, from a snail shell, a spider's web, the shape of constellations in space, the galaxies, etc. We live in the Milky Way galaxy, which we recognise to be a spiral shape, etc. We see water that forms vortices, whirlpools, etc. This is an expression of, again, this energy that is flowing in everything, and it expresses itself in the form of a spiral. So we have the three-legged, the three-part spiral here of the triskelion. So again, we look at the Celts very much revered the number 3, because we had things like birth, death and rebirth were 3 parts, and again linked. So there's an understanding that of things like reincarnation, which we kind of lost with the Judeo-Christian worldview, when everything became a sort of a timeline where it was fixed from one point to another. Most of world traditions and world spiritual traditions would see life, death and rebirth as being this ongoing cycle that goes around, and the Celts and the Druids were no different from that. So the Druids were the educators, they were the priests, they were the officials who would take these spiritual ideas and they would teach the people, and they would also be the officiators of various magical and ceremonies and things like this as well. And part of that was to connect ordinary people in this material world to this spiritual world as well. Their temples, as it were not temples like we know them. So if you see something like Stonehenge, for instance, or many of the kind of the stone circles and structures like that, it's easy to kind of almost think, or maybe they kind of were the bare bones of what was some sort of building with a roof on and walls, etc., and the stones of what's left of them. But we understand that because the Druids were very much connected with the natural world and the open air, and again, 3 parts. We have the land, the water, and we have the sky. Land, sea, sky, or if not necessarily the sea, it could be lakes, it could be watercourses, but it was understood that the world that we lived in was made up of these 3 parts, again 3. So their temples, their places of worship were outdoors. One type that we have left, because they were made from stone, would be the stone rings and the stone circles, where these ceremonies were carried out. But the most common places where the Druids would meet would be in what were known as groves. And the groves were basically clearings within forests and woodlands where the Druids would meet. People would meet for ceremonies there, and this was considered to be a very sacred place, in the forest where they would meet. So this is one of the reasons now why in my meditations, when I connect with this, I will use a visualization of being in the forest. If I can't actually go into the forest physically, then I can make that sort of connection, because this is very much important. And the connection with nature is extremely important to the Druids. They see our spirituality as being part of nature. It's not a clinical religion that's made up of these, sort of a clergy who inhabit stone cathedrals or buildings like that at all. It's very much they are out there in the elements. And of course, the British climate has always been very, very varied. So a connection to the seasons is very important. We have what's known as the wheel of the year, where we've got these, as I mentioned, the solstices. We've got the equinoxes, where day and night are the same length as well. We've got things like the harvest. We've got springtime. We've got these different festivals. And if I can jump forward now a little bit to the time of the Romans. So we've got this sort of world that's understood and inhabited by these people. They understand the flow of nature, as in the flowing spirit of the Arwen. They understand the spirits that are in nature, the trees, the animals, the land, the hills, the mountains. And they're very much a part of this. They're part of the weather, they're part of the seasons, and they tie into what's known as a pantheon of gods. So there are lots of different gods, but very similar to the Hindu gods. They all represent a different aspect of the divine, of the universe, if you like. So the god of the harvest, the god of nature, the gods of the water, the woods, etc. They are all ascribed different aspects of what the idea of a divine is, but they don't really have a one sort of god figure, if you like. It's just an understood that it's all part of this one big sort of system. So I can relate that quite easily back to something like Taoism, as well as back to the yogic traditions as well. So the Romans, of course, had gone into different parts of the world, and then to say they're religious, they kind of pick up little bits of different religions as they go, as they travel. They're kind of collectors of different religious traditions, and they incorporate them into their practices. And of course we see there are even believers amongst the Romans that believe that the emperor himself is a god, and would worship the emperor as such. But they've taken different elements from different parts of the world. They've go down to places like Egypt, and they'll bring back some of the practices of there. The Greeks, of course, with their beliefs, the Romans have incorporated big time a lot of the Greek gods, and often given them new names, but essentially they are the same sort of, again, pantheon of gods that the Greeks worshipped, really. But the problem that the Romans had was when they were invading certain areas, they wanted to gain control. So if a religion or a spiritual practice was seen as stopping them from having control, it became a problem to them. So we see in Judea, in modern day Israel, we can read the stories in the Bible and the stories of Josephus and people like that, when they record the way things were happening, that if anybody came along who was sort of trying to take away the authority from the occupying force, being the Romans, then the Romans had a problem with that, and they pretty soon and pretty kind of drastically and violently quashed any of those uprisings. So Julius Caesar, first in 55 BC, and then he sends an army over to the British Isles. They don't fare very well. They find these very fierce warriors in the Celts, presided over by the Druids, of course, who had been their spiritual leaders. Excuse me. And then again, the following year in 54 BC, because the numbers go backwards up to the start of the Common Era, then a second unsuccessful attempt is made under Julius Caesar, and then nothing happens. There is no invasion. having said that, it's not like as if nobody travels to the British Isles. There have been, at this point, for thousands of years, there has been trade done with other parts of the world, and as I mentioned before, some of those precious minerals, etc., were sort of very valuable, and people did travel to the British Isles. We've got mention even as far back as the Phoenicians and people like that coming and trading with the people of the British Isles. But as regards somebody wanted to come over and take over the Isles from these indigenous tribes that were living there, then that was kind of the big sort of attempt was made then. But as I say, nothing happened from the Romans' perspective for about another almost 80 odd years. So it was 43 AD when, under Emperor Claudius, one of his generals came to Britain and landed in the far southeast in Kent, and they successfully managed to land that invasion force, and then began the proper Roman occupation of Britain in 43 AD. So again, we had lots of stories of fierce fighting, and we have some of these. Many of the things have passed into kind of our folklore and our cultural mythology. Stories about people like Queen Boudica, who fought very fiercely against the Roman legions as they passed it on. And to be honest, Britain was not seen as a very favourable posting for a Roman soldier or legionnaire. In fact, it was literally, euphemistically, known as the arsehole of Europe, Britain. They didn't want to come here. I mean, probably they'd heard stories about our weather, and I think it was the first time that the Romans actually adopted wearing trousers, for instance. Before then, it had been kind of the little skirts that they wore, etc. Because they were used to kind of warmer climates, and they'd gone south to Africa and places like that. So yeah, it was pretty dire when they came here. Lots of rain, lots of mud, lots of forests. The whole British Isles was covered by these dense oak forests at that time, and obviously the Celts knew this climate and they knew this habitat. So it was a fierce fight to try and push across. The Romans wanted to build roads, and they wanted to do all these kind of things, build cities and erect villas and things like this. And they generally just wanted to occupy the land. They weren't particularly interested in the Celtic sort of culture at all. If it didn't cause a problem, they weren't particularly going to stamp it out. But with the advent of Christianity being adopted as the kind of official religion later on, then they had to do things about the festivals and things like that. So hence we get a lot of our ancient festivals, things like Easter and Christmas and things like that, all came from ancient from the ancient Celtic festivals, the ancient pagan festivals, which were adopted and brought Christianized and made sort of sanitized for that. When I talk about Christianity, I'm not really talking about exactly what was preached by Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, because he was very much a peace lover. He didn't advocate fighting. He didn't advocate the practices of empire building, slavery, all of these concepts that the Romans did and held on to even after the time of officially, after Emperor Constantine adopting this religion as their own. I'm not going to go into that. That will be the topic, no doubt, of one of my other videos. But suffice it to say, at this point, the Romans were not particularly interested in the religion. They were more interested in control and politics and moving forward in that way. So so this all comes to a hiatus. The Celts are pushed back and pushed back. The Druids are pushed back as the priesthood of the Celts and the influential people, the ones who sort of are making the decisions for the people and helping the people to live this kind of spiritual life that they lived. They're eventually pushed back to the far northwest of Wales, the island of Anglesey, where they are besieged by the Romans on the mainland, and eventually the Romans go across in a flotilla of boats, horses, etc., and they then proceed to massacre the vast majority of the Druids that are there. And so the Druids, as a kind of an organised elite of priests, etc., are more or less wiped out by the Romans at this point. Of course, you can't completely destroy an ideology, a belief system, a philosophy by which people have lived. And of course, it lived on with the people, and no doubt there were Druids who were kept safe, very much similar to how some of the Catholic priests were kept safe in the time of the Reformation and things like that. You know, we hear about priest holes and things like that. Well, no doubt in the dense forests and in the villages and places like that, Druids would have survived. And the Druidic beliefs and practices have filtered down through our culture and our mythology. But today, up to the 19th century, really there was no organisation of Druids at all. It was just a kind of collection of stories. The problem being that the Romans were literate people. They wrote down histories. So when we get some of the horrific stories about Druids being bloodthirsty and human sacrifices and things like this, we have to take these stories with a pinch of salt. Yes, did Druids oversee killings? Possibly. Was it really a part of their way of life? We don't really have any evidence that it was, because it was more about celebrating life and nature and things like that. But no doubt, just as every religion, every culture and every belief system has got good and bad priests, good and bad adherents to that, then I'm sure that, yes, there were ritual killings and things like that probably took place under the name of Druidry. But as I say, that doesn't mean that that was really a part of that culture as we understand it. The Romans, being the only ones that wrote things down, would make it very biased towards themselves. After all, they were trying to take control, and they didn't want the Celts to remain in control. They certainly didn't want the Celts to be presided over by a priesthood like the Druids any more than they wanted the priest caste in Judea to be ruling over the people. They wanted to be the ones under control. So propaganda is the name of the game in this situation. It still happens today. We still vilify. When I say we, there are still nations and leaders of nations that vilify certain people as being lesser people, or they making disparaging remarks about them, their culture, etc., things like that. we still see it today happening, but we know that there's often a bias. And when we look at the Celts, their tradition was an oral tradition. Think of very much along the lines of the Native Americans, where their stories are passed down, not in a haphazard way, not in a Chinese whispers way whereby the story changes, but very much adhered to. This is the story, this is how the universe works, these were our ancestors, these are the practices, these are the beliefs that we have, and these were passed down word of mouth. So when you get rid of and you massacre the vast majority of that group of people who are presiding over these beliefs and spiritual practices, then you damage that, and then hence a lot of these practices became folklore, mythology, etc., things like this. So we had a bit distorted view of it. Come the 19th century, going into the 20th century, there were various movements to try to form a modern Druidry. And today, in fact, in the world over, we have hundreds of thousands of modern Druids, often in sort of orders, but many of them are also solitary Druids, known as hedge Druids. But there are also orders, the order of Ovates, Bards and Druids is very, very big, probably the biggest organisation in the world today. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, I believe they probably are. But not just in the British Isles, but, you know, various different parts of the world, especially where the ancestors of the Brythonic people went out with, you know, probably the British Empire and things like that, to the Americas as well, to Australia, South Africa, all of these different parts. There are people today who, and they are very much connected with the cultural roots, but it's not just about that. Again, and this is why I will bring this back to meditation. It seems like I'm taking you on a big history lesson. I am a little bit, but I want to set the background. So, that said, how does this fit in with meditation? Well, to me personally, having studied the philosophies and the customs, the beliefs of Southeast Asia, China, India, Nepal, places like this, I see so many similarities, and I see them all over the world. But of course, as I started off by saying, I'm interested in this because it's to do with my ancestry, my culture, very much. And I see in those distant ancestors that a lot of the things that have influenced me spiritually from the East were also present in the culture of my ancestors over here as well. The understanding of that oneness with nature, the understanding of us having a living spirit, a flow of spiritual energy that flows through us, an understanding that life is a cycle of birth, death and rebirth, an understanding that there is another world beyond, but not like the sense of a heaven and a hell, a place of merit and a place of punishment that divides humanity across this great divide and never the twain shall meet, but a commonality between all living things, that we are all part of this natural cycle. So when I practice meditation, I very much want to be connecting with this natural cycle of nature. I want to be going within myself, inside myself. And one of the things that the Druids believe even to this day is that we can do that. We can magically, we can connect with this other world. We can connect with higher planes of existence. We can commune with ancestors. We can commune with the spirits of nature, trees, animals, etc., things like this. So this is important to me, and this is why I am keen to incorporate this into my meditation practice. I don't want to go too much further into this now because I've gone on quite a long time with this one, but I'll leave it at that. But we will continue this this deep dive into the Celts. We'll look at some of the practices in more depth and what they would have practiced and how that can be incorporated into our meditation and our beliefs now as well. But this has been absolutely fascinating to me, and as I say, the similarities between the Druidic beliefs of nature and how the universe works, how we fit in as human beings into the universe, have absolutely fascinated me, because they so much dovetail and tie into so many spiritual beliefs from around the world. If you enjoyed this, it made sense to you, you may want to subscribe to this channel. There's lots of videos on here about meditation, a little bit about my own spiritual experiences as well. If you have any comments that you want to make about this, any questions you want to ask, pop that in the comments box. If you like this, do give us a thumbs up. But until then, thank you for joining me. I do appreciate every one of you, and I hope this made some sense to you. I apologise for rambling, but this is unedited, uncut, and what you see is what you get. I try, rather like the Druids, rather like the Taoists, to go with the flow. So my words as I speak, this is me, being present. If you've watched this point, thank you very much, and bless you. Namaskaram.